This lecture continues African art, turning to major urban centers throughout the continent and the integration of Islamic and Christian motifs into the native tradition. Europeans contacted first the coastline cities such as Mbanza in Congo, which is the capital, along with others that the Portuguese had, such as Ife and Benin. Central and Western Sudan, for instance, are very important cities that became very wealthy from trans-Saharan trade since 1000 BCE, controlling the trading routes involving salt and gold, for instance. It is around these trading routes at the crossroads that kingdoms emerged, such as Mali, as seen here in green. Rulers of these regions adopted Islam, and by the 14th century they controlled the oases necessary for the caravans to travel throughout the Saharan desert. Therefore, they became incredibly wealthy and influential. These wealthy cities included, around Mali, Timbuktu and Janneh. These became centers of Islamic learning. Janneh, for instance, as highlighted here in Mali, is a major urban center by the 9th century Common Era. Here we find hundreds of terracotta figures that were produced from the 13th to the 16th centuries, here at Old Janneh in Mali, as it is called. These figures are all going to be formed by rolling up clay with a low-fired red slip clay process. These involve long cylindrical bodies, arms, and legs, and can be also inclusive of equestrian portraits, such as the one seen in the center here. Here we have the horseman from Old Janneh in Mali, produced between the 13th and 15th centuries in terracotta, in this instance fairly tall at 27 3/4 inches. The long oval head, jutting chin, and pointed oval eyes are going to be accompanied with short pants, a helmet with a chin strap. Thus, a warrior on horseback is heavily armored in this instance. This is nothing new, for associating men with portraits relating to horses are going to showcase the power and importance of warrior culture, such as that we discussed at Igbo Ukwu in Nigeria. The guardian figure seen here could be understood as such, or a hero, or a deified ancestor. These were very often found in sanctuaries in Mali, as other sanctuaries and ritual objects are going to be found in Nigeria. The narrow cylindrical forms are unique to Janneh that we see here, and are very similar to the geometric forms of sculptures in ancient Greece, such as the hero and centaur seen to the right here. Here we find that the idea of an equestrian statue representing power and authority and a warrior-like culture is common, as I showed you in the terracotta on the first slide. The notion of a man's prowess and ability to control a horse and to fight from it is common throughout the Middle East, especially in Islamic areas, where we find one of the primary motifs is going to be one of hunting and also of war, primarily of cavalrymen on horseback who are going to be shown with swords and or arrows. The prowess of military control and might is ubiquitous, for in the West, the equestrian monument, popularized by the ancient Romans, is going to be carried on even into the Renaissance. And this idea of a figure on horseback represents his ability not only to control this massive beast, but in turn, the horse is representative of the people that are being controlled and or overtaken. So in looking at this military man dressed in these fatigues and armor on horseback with this helmet, we must relate it to this long tradition of equestrian portraits. Koi Konboro, the king of Janneh, is going to convert to Islam in the 13th century. It is at this time that he's going to convert one of his palaces to a mosque. It was here that the Prophet Muhammad, in the desert outside of Mecca, received God's message to found a new religion in 610. He heard this message from the mouthpiece of God, Gabriel, the archangel who delivers messages. As in the Christian tradition, Gabriel would deliver the message to the Virgin Mary that she would give birth to Christ. He is going to found here, that is Muhammad, Islam, which is going to be the religion, literally from the Arabic, submission to God's will. Muslims are going to be those who have submitted to God's will. The Meccans, however, were not appreciative of Muhammad's original message, and they expelled him to Medina in 622. 8 years later, Muhammad would return to Mecca with an army of 10,000 of his own soldiers to oust those who would not listen to the message of God. Here we find that mosques are going to, literally from the Arabic word place of prostration, be worshiping centers that you are to kneel towards Mecca. They are a square enclosure framed by a large courtyard, and they're all based on Muhammad's own home in Medina that he sets up. Mosques need to have a minaret or a tower to call the faithful to prayer on one side. Thus we find these become easily identifiable architectural features in the Islamic world. The flat hypostyle prayer hall will always be oriented towards Mecca, and again because these are largely built in desert areas, there's low precipitation, so the roofs are primarily flat. They don't have to be angled to allow water or snow to be filtered off. Here is the open courtyard at the particular mosque here that must be included in the design and will be through till today. It is all centered on, importantly, a wall with a niche. This is known as, and you direct your attention towards, the Qibla wall. This faces towards Mecca and acts much as a compass or needle point, showing us which direction we need to face to ensure our prayers are heard. The mihrab niche centered on it certainly could be understood as the needle point because it is a focal point taken from other traditions, other religions. Koikenboro, the king of Janae, would convert and transform his palace into the first of 3 massive mosques in the city. These are all made of adobe brick or sun-dried clay with straw, as we discussed with the Inca temples in South America. The Qibla wall is going to find at its center the mihrab niche, directing one's attention and prayers to Mecca. We find that the design is traditional by way of mosques, for it has this hypostyle hall interior space with a courtyard out front. It was said originally in the first example, in the first version of this mosque, to rival the Kaaba at Mecca, this central pilgrimage spot for all of Muslims. However, the later austere rulers had it razed or leveled to the ground because it was too ostentatious. Here we have the ruins of the original mosque after it was destroyed. It was rebuilt in a new austere style, and only in 1906 and 07 did it return to the original glory of the original mosque, now known as the Great Friday Mosque at Janae, Mali. Here we have the example in the style of the 13th century original. The plan, as can be seen here, has the interior space outlined in a modular design just like other mosques, such as the one shown in Tunisia, and is modeled on Muhammad's own house in Medina with a courtyard out front. The Qibla wall still faces towards Mecca, as is tradition for mosques. The mihrab niche is in the center as discussed, thus pointing us like a compass towards Mecca. The marketplace facade is directly outside of the mihrab and is going to face the so-called marketplace, giving it its title. Its characteristic interlocking designs of the towers and the protruding wooden sections are going to make it possible to ensure the mosque is continually refurbished. The finials, on top of which we find ostrich eggs, represent fertility and purity. And of course, this is important for any Muslim worshiping within. The engaged columns are actually buttresses, very characteristic of West African mosque architecture that help hold up the structure, just as these buttresses in the Gothic design in Europe are going to help hold up these very tall vertical structures, such as Chartres Cathedral or Reims. The torons are one of the most distinct features of this mosque, for they are projecting wooden beams that support scaffolding and people to step on as they annually replaster this mosque, protecting this mud brick adobe clay core. The houses surrounding the mosque are also built of adobe walls with reinforced buttressing with the same architectural principles. The rooms themselves, much like those at Taos, New Mexico for the Puebloan peoples, are going to open inward into courtyards. Turning to Southeast Africa, we find that the trade network runs along the rivers, where gold, ivory, animal skins are all going to be filtered through coastal towns that have been built by Arabs. Here we're going to have the Shona people, who are going to give Zimbabwe its name, for they are going to produce houses of stone, or Zimbabwe. Hence, Zimbabwe, literally houses of stone, takes its name from this civilization, who had, as each family unit, a ring or wall of stone with houses inside each area. The Masons for this great civilization incorporated the massive boulders that were native to this area in Zimbabwe. With uniform granite blocks, they built up a series of tall enclosing walls on a hilltop. Each one of these enclosures, as mentioned, is a family's living space. Hence, they are protected, and also each family unit is differentiated from the rest of the city of 10,000 people. The largest of these complexes is known as Imbahuru, or the Great Enclosure, which is ringed by a wall 800 feet long, 32 feet tall, and 17 feet thick. A massive structure that is on par with those seen in the Neolithic period in the Near East. The conical tower especially is reminiscent of that because the inside of the wall has stone enclosures with adobe platforms that are built up without mortar. The 18-foot diameter, 30-foot tall canonical tower was originally capped with an ornamental series of stonework and is reminiscent and resembles a granary, and is the way in which the civilization showcases and represents a good harvest, that you would put grain in this, much like granaries we have today seen in the United States and other areas in Europe. The tower itself looks a lot like the Great Stone Tower at Jericho because it is battered and/or has walls that slope inward toward the top for stability. The battering, where walls slope inward, is going to be seen throughout the walls in the Zimbabwean town here, for it ensures that the walls will not topple, and because of the 17-foot thick nature of them, that they are incredibly stable, that battering rams and other devices cannot, of course, penetrate them at the time. The royal residence or palace is the nucleus of the city that would radiate around it for a mile with 10,000 people within its population. So a very impressive large city of the time, we can certainly agree. The far-flung trading network is demonstrated by the Portuguese medallions found here, along with Persian pottery and Chinese porcelain. So we know that they traded with many different civilizations around the globe. Turning to Ethiopia, we have the Aksum civilization, where the highlands will be controlling the trade routes to the Red Sea, and thus the influx to the Middle East of ivory, gold, slaves, frankincense, myrrh, and salt. Ethiopia, of course, today, and Somalia are known as coastal or naval civilizations. The Aksumite king Nzana is going to be one of the first to convert to Christianity in the 4th century, the same time at which the Emperor Constantine converts. The coinage that he then mints is going to bear the Christian cross, showcasing that this is now a Christian nation. Through building campaigns like the Nzana stele seen here, he erected monolithic versions over 95 feet tall with architectural details including false doors, windows, beams, and they function as tomb markers or burial sites for the elite. As a detail shown here, it is as though we can enter this structure at the base, which looks very familiar to another massive tower and a tomb at the base that they would be familiar with in ancient Rome. namely the column of Trajan in the Forum of Trajan, which had at its base the burial place for Emperor Trajan and a door to enter to find his ceremonial ashes, on top of which we have a massive column detailing the exploits of his military conquest of Dacia, or modern-day Romania. The idea of carving a domestic structure that imitated a tomb or mausoleum would remind us also of the Etruscans, who did the same, carving out at areas like Cervetere and their necropoli, the places where their dead relatives would be laid to rest and continue living in the next life. This Christian Ethiopian nation would have a new capital after the Persian conquest of Arabia, when Lalibela is going to eponymously found and name a new city, much like Constantine is going to found Constantinople. This Zagwe king Lalibela creates a new Jerusalem, as he wanted to, in Ethiopia. Eponymous means it's named after him as far as the city is concerned. Rock-hewn sanctuaries are thus created that pepper the areas surrounding this capital and leave no doubt that it is a Christian nation. The largest of these can be found in Bet Georges, or the Church of St. George, which is a 13th century structure carved out of solid volcanic rock. Hammers and chisels were used to cut trenches around this volcanic tuff, and 40 feet down with this modified Greek cross plan that would be familiar to those that are looking at Orthodox churches, both in Jerusalem and in the East. Now, the structure and how they actually created Bet Georges is not unlike the Great Sphinx, whereby you're going to be taking one solid series of bedrock and cutting around it down to reveal a form. Now, Bet Georges is also going to be familiar to those who know Christian architecture in the region, for it is very much indebted to both Islamic but also Byzantine Orthodox structures. The hemispherical dome ceiling on the interior specifically is related to Byzantine churches that would have been seen by these Ethiopian designers and artisans while on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. These are going to be found throughout the ancient world, with San Vitale being the best surviving Byzantine church we have in the West, and the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, which certainly would have been visible and is designed around a central domed structure to circumambulate the rock from which Muhammad is going to descend on his night journey. However, it would be in Jerusalem that these artists would have seen the Holy Sepulchre Church, which is home today to an Orthodox church shared between 3 Christian churches. On the interior, we have a central hemispherical dome structure surrounded by equidistant Greek cross arms. Thus, at Bet Georges, we do have a structure that is in form Christian. However, the origins look very Eastern because they actually are taken from Buddhist and Hindu rock-hewn temples, which had been in existence and perfected and refined for over 2 millennia. These can be found such as the Kalasha temple at Ellora that we will discuss when turning to Hindu art and also to Buddhist temples. Now, the Kongo kingdom is the earliest known examples that we have of wooden artworks. These are very rare because they do not survive the test of time. The capital is Mbanza of the Congo, which has 6 provinces surrounding it and 100,000 square miles. Here we find objects like the zoomorphic head of Angola, which was produced around 750 Common Era and made of wood. This headdress and mask has an elongated snout and pointed ears, like a carnivorous lion or bear. The idea of combining a headdress of a feline form goes all the way back to the Paleolithic period, 30,000 years ago, with Hohenstein-Stadel, Germany, and the feline head, which probably represents a shaman performing a religious ritual, and perhaps this also would have been used in the same way as the other masked dancers we talked about and performers in other cultures, both in Polynesia and throughout Melanesia and these islands in the Pacific, and the Pacific Northwest with the specific cannibal bird masks. This would resemble the masking traditions still in use in Africa to this day that we will discuss in next time at the next lecture for African art. Now, King Nzinga Ankua in 1491 would convert to Christianity, making it the state religion here in the Congo. He solidified trade with the Portuguese through copper, salt, ivory, cloth, and continued the Nigerian tradition of also trading their own people as slaves. Now, with this, we have many missionaries that are brought in with religious objects, Catholic missionaries specifically, who have a different visual tradition than the Protestants. Here we have one of these early examples bringing together the Christian and African native traditions with the crucifix, this one produced in the early 17th century and 10.5 inches tall. Here we're going to have the same mirroring European prototypes reinstated in African terms so they speak to the local people. Now, in the African tradition, we often would have the most significant person who would temporally and spiritually guide a people being in the center, flanked by others on either side. So therefore, we have with this tradition an easily recognizable and identifiable understanding of hegemony or power in a civilization. The idea of a Christian crucifix, which has Christ on a cross, can be seen in one of two ways. One, the earlier version, is that of Christ triumphant, or the Christus triumphant seen on the left here, which has Christ triumphing over death shown as alive on the cross, versus the Christus patiens on the right, which is the suffering Christ, the dead and broken Christ. What is interesting with missionaries, we find that almost ubiquitously in, say, the Scandinavian North, in the New World in Central and South America, and here in Africa, missionaries and artisans almost always opt for a living Christ, because this is the optimistic promise of rebirth and renewal and resurrection, not death that you want to focus on. Here we have the hands and the feet stylized in the local tradition that we see here in African art. Flanking Christ, we have the other figures necessary for identifying this as a person of power. The abstraction, just to show you, going back to the Nok culture, is distinctly West African and is going to communicate to the people more clearly what type of figure it is we're looking at here, a god. Off to the sides, we have people that seem to be praying while in fact they are clapping, which is a common gesture of respect in the Congo and one that people would understand. You would respect this individual that is in the center by way of the hierarchy of scale that these figures are much smaller than, thus showing respect and conveying it to him. This would continue to integrate more and more European motifs as time goes on, such as here in the Congo, where styles and materials are then produced for export, such as ivory that very commonly is going to be valued by European traders, such as the Portuguese-style hunting horn seen here, made specifically for export to Europe, like many of the artifacts and many of the crafts and arts that actually still exist in Africa today that we will discuss next time when we turn to Africa in modernity.